don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this conversation, I spoke with Zaretta Hammond, who some of you may be familiar with from her book published in 2014 titled Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. We talked about that book, but she's also working on a new book that should be out sometime early next year. One of the things that I really like about the way that she thinks about this topic is the focus on responsive and the cognition and learning pieces that are important in that conversation. We talked quite a bit about the importance of direct and explicit instruction and scaffolding and science of learning. I brought up project-based learning, and she pushed back a little bit, and that was a fun part of the conversation as I clarified some of my thinking and asked her to clarify some of hers. In the end, I think we agreed that there are important pieces about culturally responsive teaching that go beyond what is traditionally and often referred to in that conversation. As always, I encourage you to check out our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, for our professional development and professional learning services. There you'll find all of our services, our blogs, this podcast, and much more. You can always reach out to me as well at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's that conversation with Zaretta. I am with Zaretta Hammond, and we're going to talk about culturally responsive teaching in the brain and her new book that she is currently working on, but I think from her description, I think is a great, should be a great conversation, and some of the things that I talk a lot about with science of learning and the ways in which we can, I guess, leverage those kinds of things. And but we'll get into that. But before we do, I want to give you an opportunity to say hello. And as we were joking about before, you're internationally known, Freddie Tiffany. But who let the folks know who they're listening to, and maybe some more things about you that you think are important.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Zaretta Hammond, and I consider myself a teacher educator. I started to research culturally responsive teaching in the brain probably, in the early 90s when I was a expository writing teacher. So when I was in the classroom, I taught writing only. I wasn't an English teacher who taught some writing on the side. My job was to help students become really good essay writers, argumentative essay, middle school, high school, community college level. And then I think based on that success was asked to come out and start doing professional development with our department. And that has led to, more requests for teacher development and professional development and training. And I actually wrote Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain in response to some teachers suggesting you need to write this down. It really did not have an intention to write a book, but took what I was doing to get, progress for my students and what I was sharing with them and codified that in Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. So now that's what I do. A lot of coaching teams who are trying to get better, right? What's happening within their professional learning community so that they can take a more equity-focused approach to that PLC work. And that's what I do with my time besides, writing and, speaking.
Well, if you don't mind, can you share the book that you're working on that's not out yet, but because I think we'll probably bridge into some of that conversation because I think it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, the title of the book is Rebuilding Students' Learning Power, Teaching for Instructional Equity and Cognitive Justice. And the intent is to take Chapter 8 of Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain and really to kind of blow it out in a way that really helps teachers build their capacity to coach their students to higher levels of learning, to really reduce their dependence on over-scaffolding because you want the student to do the learning. But how do you do that? Because a lot of our teachers don't get training in instructional decision-making, so within that classroom, the instructional core. So it really is taking the best of what we know from cognitive neuroscience, social neuroscience, and this new, codification of all those things under the umbrella of the science of learning and make it practical. So less about here's a brain-based strategy. I instead say, what are you doing with the student? How are you coaching the student? What are you saying to the student? How are you helping the student develop these aspects? So that's what this book is. And I really look forward to informing professional learning communities, because there's a point at which professional learning communities come together. They look at their data as a team and they are thinking about what are the interventions, what should be the thing we do. And too often their next step is to go to, Google. Well, Google's not, in the business of teacher education. So I don't know what you're Googling, but that's where the strategic knowledge about how we are building students' information processing skills, leveraging the science of learning, and I wanted to provide them with some kind of text, some kind of information that could guide some of the things they could do to help students kind of move from dependent learning to cognitively independent learning.
Well, it's going to take all my patience not to go straight to that conversation, because that is right in my wheelhouse. But culturally responsive teaching and some of the nuances and complexities is as well. So as we were talking a little bit before we hit record, you were talking about your work in culturally responsive teaching. And I think you mentioned something like, you a little different take on it, a little bit different approach to it. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's less a different approach, but making sure that it's kind of more holistic. I think there is a misconception about culturally responsive teaching, and people use it like it's a thing, like it's a program, and they say it. Oh, we're going to talk about culturally responsive teaching. Well, what are we talking about? Mm-hmm. And so, because it is a integrated, element. So this is kind of like if we are talking about the science of reading and Scarborough's reading rope, right? You actually see the visual of that reading rope. The whole idea of the rope was their individual strands in terms of language and word recognition. Those are braided together, and then those larger strands are braided together. Culturally responsive teaching is very similar. So I created the Ready for Rigor frame to start to unpack it, because it was really clear to me that generally teachers and administrators, leaders didn't understand it. Even more so, white educators didn't understand it. And the majority of our teaching force are white people. So, I wanted to bring something that was very accessible so that they could really start to let go of the misconceptions that it was only about relationships. That's number one. Or that it was about, affirming students' cultural identity and that somehow you needed to get them motivated in this way. Those are the biggest misconceptions. It doesn't mean that those things aren't relevant, but it really means that those things are not sufficient by themselves. That the other piece we haven't talked about is, how are you building a community of learners? How are you improving students' information processing skills? Because what we know is, in the US public schools, we're predicated on sorting students by class, by race, by language, and each of those getting a different level of rigor in the curriculum. So my whole point is that one of the things that students who were most marginalized didn't get was the ability to build their cognitive muscle. All brains have that, so it's not like they're less intelligent, but we do know that you have to work that muscle, that brain, to build dendrites, and dendrites then become neural pathways. Neural pathways, when you start making connections, become schema. And that schema we also know as background knowledge. The deeper that background knowledge, the more powerful learner you're going to be. And it's not just about knowing facts. It's about understanding connections and being able to take inert information and turn it into usable knowledge. That should be at the core of what the people are talking about when they talk about culturally responsive teaching. But somehow we have forgotten the instructional part, right? And then it's just kind of reduced to this kind of gimmick of motivation and engagement.
Yeah. It resonates with me, and I see those kinds of things. I've not heard it called a gimmick, but it does, that resonates. It makes sense. Can you give an example of how a teacher would move beyond that sort of surface level, that gimmick, to something that's more substantive and helping make those connections in terms of culturally responsive? Think about the content. Is it the product? Is it? It's more than just presenting books with authors that look like them, right?
Yeah, it is more than just, and here's the thing about it. It is important to have a diverse library in the classroom. It is important to have, lessons and content that are grounded in students' community, culture. And it's not just because you want to be inclusive. That this is where the science of learning comes in. It's because that is schema. And if you're going to introduce any new learning, it must be coupled with existing schema. That's just basic brain science. But if you're not doing that, you're not being culturally responsive, because you have to know the culture, the way the students, schema is organized. You have to have that ability to recognize how the student approaches learning, because even if the student's underperforming, doesn't mean that even if they live in a low income area, doesn't mean that their learning is not happening, right? That's a kind of a reductionist view. The problem is student zip code. No, that's not the problem. The problem is we don't actually know how to build student capacity. So when we think about it in terms of practices, there are several practices, and it depends, again, what part you're talking about. So if a teacher wanted to talk about the relational part, then we can say, hey, what would be the relational way in which a teacher could bring a more culturally responsive, approach to it? And I would say that really is making time in the first 10 minutes to create social connection. And I am not talking about morning meeting, right? Because that's what you're doing in your SEL block. Like, we just reduced it all to, we're going to talk about emotions during morning meeting, and then we're going to, it's like, instead, a teacher who's striving in the relational realm to be more culturally responsive is going to think about, how do I increase oxytocin? How do I bring a collectivist view to that? And again, a misconception that teachers have is collectivism means group work. Like, everybody from a collectivist culture wants to do things together. That's reductionist. And so recognizing that in all cultures, there are, folks that are introverts. There are folks that like their solitude. Like, everything's not a group activity. But this is what I see, particularly white teachers doing. Like, it's just this reductionist approach to these things. So in the realm of relationships, when you understand collectivist learning, then you know that, and this is what Vygotsky talks about as social cultural learning theory, that people connect, they talk, they share through story, they make a connection that actually increases a sense of belonging. That sense of belonging increases oxytocin. Oxytocin allows us to take psychological and intellectual risks. So if the teacher doesn't know how to transform those first 10 minutes, and if what's happening when they walk in the classroom is the teacher's like, oh, here's a do now on the board, be silent while I take attendance, that's going to go against helping students who may be on the periphery find their way into the center of the life of the classroom. So that's relational. Now, I can go into another, 5 minutes about, well, what would you be doing in the realm of information processing and helping students be more powerful? The biggest challenge is we try to reduce it to a teacher move, versus how are we looking at not just the culture part, but the word responsive. How will I respond to the student in front of me? What's personal warmth? How am I responding when I want to help the student level up their learning, right? And so each one of those quadrants, your own awareness, learning partnerships with the relationships, information processing in terms of building schema and brain power, and a community of learners, like the students actually coming together to improve their learning how to learn skills, right? Those are 4 core areas. And each one of them would bring, based on what you're trying to accomplish, a more culturally responsive way to do that.
So it's less about sort of activities or discrete kinds of things like that. One might say gimmicks, right? Playing rap music as the students walk in or something silly like that, right? But more about building that community, that sort of social cohesion, that belongingness of some might say building a reputation for oneself, and how do you interact and relate with the others in the classroom, and what is our sort of shared understanding and vision of what we're all doing here, and what we're hoping to get out of this, those kinds of things. Is that a sort of accurate way?
It could include those, right? But I would agree with you, just thinking playing rap music is going to be culturally responsive, right? That is kind of like the lowest denominator. Right. So I think that what we're talking about is the idea of creating a kind of a container so that students have a sense of themselves and that they can hold on to their identity, racial, cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and it not compete with or be in opposition to their learner identity. When American schools, that's how they set it up, right? And so a culturally responsive teacher who's looking at this through an anti-racist lens would understand how to create an environment where students can come. The classroom becomes a dojo for the students to do kind of deep learning, that it's set up for productive struggle versus a pedagogy of compliance. Too many children of color, in particular, poor white children, are caught in these classrooms where it's a pedagogy of compliance. Like, I can do an activity, but everything else is highly monitored. When the student talks, quiet is valued. So even if you did that activity, that might bring in something from the student's culture, if you're doing that other thing, you cannot be a culturally responsive educator, because all you're trying to do is reinforce this notion of schooling as, social reproduction, right? So
there's a couple questions and threads that I think are related, and pedagogy of compliance, I think is something we talk about, shifting from compliance to commitment in our work. Like, how do we shift that in our professional development work? How do we help teachers shift that dynamic from sort of a push dynamic of teaching to something that includes at least more what I would say pull teaching? How do I get what's in students' heads out and really get that interchange and that exchange going? And is the work that they're doing interesting? A lot of project-based learning work. Is it meaningful, relevant? And I think certainly at least some touch, some overlaps in that work. You've talked about the science of learning, and your new book certainly is getting into that. So I think there's some segues here, but there's maybe a sort of multifaceted question, if I may. How do you see sort of culturally responsive teaching fitting in with, terms and terminology and approaches like DEI and equity? You've mentioned equity. I don't know how you define that. Those kinds of things. And the sort of the add-on question part is, I will hear people say pretty regularly that are sort of science-lived learning kinds of advocates is that the best some versions, something like this, culturally responsive teaching, the best equity measures are to get students to learn and build knowledge, and therefore direct or explicit instruction is, because it's most efficient, evidence shows that that's the way to go about teaching, which isn't necessarily pedagogy of compliance, but it's getting in that realm. So
I don't know. We could have a robust conversation about that.
Yeah.
We're not going to label direct instruction. Like, that's so old school, right? No direct instruction. Like, everybody, every adult who's out there learning anything new, at some point gets some direct instruction. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the water. Like, this is part of, I think, the challenge of being able to talk about, how we help students become more powerful learners. Because the first part of that question about the relationship between DEI, equity, culturally responsive teaching. And what I see is school districts and those leading school districts lumping it all in a bucket. All of it that seems to be anything about rectifying the achievement gaps that we've allowed to grow. And those achievement gaps are grown in schools. It's not an at-home problem. That anything that is related to that then gets in this DEI bucket. The biggest challenge with that is we still then allow ourselves to mask the reality of our instructional practices, right? And so to me, I don't know how people are using DEI, these days, but originally the idea was around diversity and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And when I'm working with teams, and I help them, we actually unpack this. I have a document, and it's called The Distinctions of Equity, right? And equity, defining it, building on the National Equity Project's definition, which I really appreciate, which is reducing the predictability of who's at the top and who's at the bottom, right? Disrupting reproductive practices that negatively create that gap, and cultivating the unique gifts and talents of every student. Now, that you can look at that through a lens of, well, who are the ones that are always at the bottom, and who are the ones always at the top? That's when you start to see the racial linguistic what's the word that I'm looking for? Dichotomy, or sorting, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so that's when we start to talk about that achievement gap. So when I'm talking about the distinctions of equity, I help people understand the difference between diversity and inclusion, which is really kind of a social dynamic. We want to have spaces and places that are more inclusive, that see diversity as its strength, not as a problem. Mm-hmm. And that is a bit different from the way culturally responsive teaching, as it was coined by Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, which was inclusive of academic prowess. Because if you actually look at DEI, a lot of that has not anything to do with instruction. So I don't necessarily, they may have some relationship, but it's not like, oh, all those things, equity, culturally responsive teaching, and DEI are all in the same bucket. Here's a thing that the science of learning tells us, right? All instruction is culturally responsive, and the question is, to whose culture is it responding? What schema are you putting out as the core schema in an assumption of bodies of knowledge? And sometimes that, if you actually center that around Eurocentric bodies of knowledge, you may miss the bodies of knowledge that students bring in. Moll and his colleagues back in the day talked about that as funds of knowledge. And then, so when we talk about the science of learning, one of the key rules, if you will, brain rules, is all new learning must be coupled with existing knowledge, right? This is the idea of elaboration, where you're mixing in the working memory, the new and the known. Well, if I don't know what the students know, I don't know how to actually activate that existing schema in order to, hence the culture part. But my responsiveness, what will I do when I start to understand and have cognitive insight? So now I know the right metaphor to bring in. I know how to help the student kind of do that mixing and chewing on the content, so that working memory is starting to create new schema, new connections, meaning making that stretches from what the student knows currently to new understandings. And here's the challenge. Project-based learning by itself doesn't grow that. So if the student is just being engaged in a project, but is not building their background knowledge, is not learning how to learn and perfecting those skills, no one's coaching the student around that, just having some cool projects is not going to build information processing prowess. It really is geared for students who are already independent learners. But if the student is 6 months to a year behind, it has really no pathway for acceleration. So this is where the science of learning becomes really important. Culturally responsiveness in terms of being able to really understand, how do I get insight into that student's schema so that I can build on it, I can anchor and twist, right? I can create the cognitive hook. But that's not how teachers talk. So even when you hear them talk about culturally responsive teaching, it's kind of relegated to this DEI bucket that is just kind of like engagement and motivation, but no change to instruction.
So I would agree with you about project-based learning in many ways that I see it implemented and advocated for, and I'm highly critical of that. But when we work with teachers and project-based learning, I use a lot of that same language that you talk about, and want to make sure we sort of disabuse teachers of this idea that there's no direct or explicit instruction involved, there's no scaffolding, there's no recognition of background knowledge and building upon those things. Matter of fact, it's really, really important. So I think your point is well taken, and our work in that realm is really focused on building on, we like the framework that John Hattie uses, surface, deep, and transfer learning. And so let's make sure that we're using the science of learning and the evidence to say, how do we build that knowledge with direct or explicit instruction as appropriate, and then use inquiry and collaborative activities to extend it into deep and transfer, those kinds of things. And one of the things we want to do is to say, let's take a driving question and then develop that need to know list. What do we need to know in order to answer that question, do this kind of thing well? And part of the reason we want to do that is to develop that skill set of identifying and framing problems with questions. But the other part is to say, it helps as a formative assessment to sort of get to your point, is like, what do they know about this? What are the things that they bring to the table, so that then we can build upon it or correct it, or those kinds of things. And I am very impatient with people who are advocates of inquiry, progressive, whatever, PBL, who either say things like, well, the students don't need to know that much because they can Google it, or we're not supposed to teach, we're just supposed to let the kids figure it out. That to me is, we say that's a disaster. That's terrible for kids. So we should have that appropriate scaffolding in that project-based learning process.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But here's the challenge. You have students who are coming into a grade, say fifth grade, who may be reading a year or more behind. Mm-hmm. The push for great, high quality, grade level materials, right? Just being able to understand the appropriate amount of scaffolding, and where are you going to fade the scaffold because students' capacity is growing. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really key thing to look at when people are starting to look at what is kind of the purpose of culturally responsive teaching, right? The purpose is to grow the student's capacity to be a more powerful learner. And so being able to engage them in all the things that you've talked about, but being mindful of where are the gaps, because being able to move through the current lesson in that engaged way that you talk about doesn't close gaps. Acceleration means you have to get more than a year's growth in a year's time. Where is that going to happen? So I see a lot of teachers, even in how they're oriented, and this isn't about project-based learning, because I've seen it done well, but a lot of those practices are oriented toward classrooms of students who are already independent learners. And what I'm talking about is those number of students who are coming into the grade dependent learners. And the teacher has a tendency to over scaffold and never fade those scaffolds. That's a problem. So it's not really the debate or the examination of project-based learning or any other approach. Is, can the teacher, using instructional decision-making skills, pedagogical content knowledge, the things, when I was a baby teacher, we cut our teeth on, that teachers going through a 12-month residency program right now are not getting a lot of exposure to, let alone skill development. Mm-hmm. So this is the challenge that I see. And so, and that I'm trying to address in the support that I provide to teachers and districts.
Yeah. So I think if this makes sense, identifying the cognitive complexity of the work that we're asking them to do, what's their prior academic achievement, what do they bring to this table, and then how can we continue to scaffold just as much as they need, but not more than they need.
No, I don't think that's really what I'm speaking to. I think there are some elements of that, but there has to be a plan for, and this is what Joel Rose talks about. He calls it the iceberg problem, that every time a student moves to the next grade, they have an iceberg that's forming below the surface, water surface that you cannot see, of this unfinished learning. So the question is, scaffold just enough to get you through. Again, sounds like language that we would use if students are already independent learners. They know how to learn new content. They know how to regulate their own learning. They're metastrategic in how they approach a task, can do cognitive task analysis. But for the students who can't, where are they getting those skills? And when we look about equity, we look back at that definition of equity, reducing the predictability of who's going to be succeeding, who's going to be failing. When we start to look at the learning curve of a district, how are you reducing the number of students who are not reading on grade level, right? So that you don't have to over scaffold. We're not tending to that group. So everything you're saying, yes, for our students who are already there, who are on grade level, they're going to the next grade. We want them excited. But what about this group that's having a gaps that grow? We grow achievement gaps in schools. That's just a given. That's what the research tells us. But this is where Hattie talks about collective efficacy. How do we all get smarter together? What is happening in the PLC where we're not paying attention to, are we building students' capacity, not just to get through the lesson or the unit, but to actually learn how to learn? And I just don't see that that's part of the conversation typically.
Well, I would say that cognitive complexity and prior academic achievement would apply to even the least independent learners, because it's all relative. You say, well, what can they handle? What are they ready for? And if they're not ready, then we need to make sure that we're doing those things that would support them in that process.
But I'm going to stop you there. Support so they get through is not the same as closing their gaps, because they're going to go to the next grade, and are they going to get support there? Well, now we're continuing over scaffolding. So this might be a point we agree to disagree on, and maybe just don't have time to unpack it. But I can tell you, when I sit with district leaders and they say 18% of our, middle schoolers are reading on grade level, There's no way you can march students through lessons.
Mm-hmm.
There is unfinished learning. I'm not saying that you don't do anything. They still need just what you're talking about. But part of the professional learning, the problem of practice for the adults is there's unfinished learning that we have to help students accelerate. We can't close those gaps for them. There are not enough instructional minutes, but we can build students' capacity to actually close those gaps while they're still being exposed to grade level content, meeting grade level content standards, as well as, engaging in, the capacity building that's appropriate for that grade. I think we're saying very similar things, but I think there's a nuance to it that clearly is not being attended to, because I go out and one of the first questions I ask schools is, what's your reading scores? You know what generally I hear? 30%. And I ask them, what does that mean? 30% of our students are on grade level reading. So what that really means when you say it in reality is 70% of your students cannot read grade level text. You are over scaffolding them through that lesson if they cannot read that for themselves, fourth grade and up. That teacher's doing a lot more of that cognitive lifting than the student is, unless you're closing those gaps.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say support them in closing those gaps, and sometimes we do, because we do a lot of work in the inquiry space, people will say, I'm supposed to use inquiry all the time and give students all this autonomy. And I say, especially like if you're teaching kids to read, that is not a time to use inquiry, which is a little bit different than what we're talking about. When you say over scaffolding, what do you mean by that? Or can you give me an example of that?
Like, teachers doing too much front loading. They're getting sentence frames that never go away. There's a overabundance of charts and notes on the walls. So the student doesn't have, there's a part of that cognitive load that has been dispersed to what the teacher's doing. The teacher telling the student step by step the next thing. And I've seen it even in project-based learning. Like, project-based learning ain't magic. Like, it's not like we want the best of those things to happen. But the reality is teachers only teach from what they are able to do. So I've seen teachers trained in project-based learning where they then revert back to their own default setting. Like, I'm doing all the things, but yes, you're still over scaffolding, right? And so again, rescue behaviors, putting in place, breaking it down, the content down too much. When the student gets stuck, I call it leading the witness, right? Most of the time we know when the teacher's doing the majority of the work, because when the teacher stops, the student sits.
So then your suggestion and your advocacy then is to not provide those supports, or
no,
what is
not what I'm saying at all.
Okay,
I'm saying that if you've gotten yourself in a place where you're doing that kind of scaffolding, then you're going to have to actually think about, how am I building student capacity? Because you can't reduce your over scaffolds, your excess scaffolds, until you can help the student actually carry more of that cognitive load, do that chewing, be aware of their learning moves. But that kind of instruction is not typically what's happening. Teachers are moving students through the content and not developing these enabling skills so that the student actually can do that work. So I'm not suggesting that we aren't. I'm suggesting that we have a bigger task in front of us if indeed you find yourself working in a school where, yes, that percentage of students who are reading on grade level, because what we know is they probably also have shallow background knowledge, who we're coming out of classrooms that are focused on a pedagogy of compliance, then we know that the adults have been doing way more of that work. And if there's not an examination, I call it assessing current reality, of where can we start to make one or two key shifts, right? How can we start to slowly build students' capacity for that, take up that cognitive load? So it's kind of, think of it, it's like the personal trainer. You go to the personal trainer, does assessment of what you can do. And like, okay, we know where we need to get you. I need to get you where you can, lift a 50-pound weight and do X, Y, and Z with it. But given where you are at, I can only really start you off with a 10-pound. I'm not going to just like not give you, give you a 50-pound weight, or it's not an all or nothing kind of situation. But this is back to my point about instructional decision making. Most teachers don't know how to close that gap. When I say we shouldn't over scaffold, I shouldn't provide a scaffold at all. That is the only way we think about it. We don't actually see that we raise our own children, those of us that are parents and who have raised children, with the expectation that productive struggle's there. So you're going to get a little direct instruction on things. You're going to, find your own way in terms of being able to get feedback loops as you are starting to get, more skilled at kind of leading your own life, moving toward adulting by the time you're 18 or ready to go off into the world, right? But we don't do that in schools. So even asking teachers what productive struggle looks like, it's just jargon that we use. Because most teachers cannot break down for you what they would be doing to facilitate productive struggle. They're so focused on strategies, and even things like project-based learning has become kind of a strategies. It's a program with these strategies but the teacher still doesn't actually interact with the student in a way that the teacher is kind of channeling Mr. Miyagi, right? Wax on, wax off, right? It still, as the magic of project-based learning is, if I take you through these things, then the learning is going to happen. And like I said, it's not that I'm against project-based learning. It's not that I'm against scaffolding, but scaffolds need to fade. And they fade because you have taught the student, right? Whether that's in a dojo when you're a martial artist, whether that's in the gym because you're a personal trainer, you are building their capacity to do that thing without you. At a certain point, maybe you're only spotting them. I don't think we've perfected that as a skill set for the adults in education.
Right. Well, I would not disagree with any of that. I think I hear you saying you're sort of wanting to focus on building the metacognition, the skill set to learn how to think, and to be thinking about your thinking, and thus that am I on the right track?
I would say that I think metacognition is in the realm of, magical thinking. Metacognition doesn't change our ability to actually do new things. Metacognition is just that. It's thinking about your thinking. It's a level of awareness. But if my thinking ability is low, my reading skill is low, I am dependent on the teacher to do most of the kind of chewing and the heavy cognitive work, me thinking about my thinking doesn't change anything. Somebody still has to give me some new moves. So this is what Ron Rickard talks about as being meta-strategic. How are you teaching the student, kind of like chess players, the grand master teaching a novice, hey, let's actually just look at this board and let's just talk about the permutations of possible moves and what happens when you move there. Now, that's being meta-strategic, but those conversations typically don't happen. Teachers usually don't have a lot of time to confer with students. When I was a writing teacher, that was one of the key things I had to place in my classroom. Who's doing the talking? What opportunities are there for students to talk? And not just collaborate. That's, again, an overused word. We use all this jargon. It sounds super cool. But the fact is, the results tell us we're not getting all the impact of those potential cool things, right? So I think the biggest challenge is not just metacognition, but teaching students to manipulate their learning moves. Being meta-strategic has to couple that. So thinking about your thinking, if you have low-level thinking, ain't going to get you higher thinking.
Well, some of the things you've said are in some ways triggers for some of the science of learning folks. And, I've had lots of conversations, some of which are with science and learning researchers and things. And I'm sure you're aware, productive struggle is a term that they rail against pretty regularly. I'm also very critical of people, I do think direct and explicit instruction is very important, and I think it's important not to caricature it and straw man it as something that doesn't involve interaction. I mean, there's different ways to define direct and explicit, but it shouldn't be just lecture and drill and kill, sit and spit, any more than inquiry should be discovery learning. But the pieces, one of the things that I think I hear you saying is really developing a skill set and a mindset of a learner, and meta-strategic. I love the work of Ron Richard. He's been on the podcast a few times. We use some of his work in our workshops, and that to me is heavily reliant on the role of inquiry. And I get in all kinds of arguments, discussions, discourse, something like that with especially science of learning advocates, of which, again, I think science of learning, which, however you define that, I mean, right now it tends to be aligned with direct or explicit instruction. It probably shouldn't be, but that's the term that's there's an alignment there in most people's minds, because the people who are pushing what they would say science of learning is saying inquiry is bad for kids, and they say, what is inquiry? Do you have any evidence for it? And I say, well, it's a slippery kind of concept, and there's different ways to approach it. Ron has some great questions and ways to think about inquiry. Facilitative questions is something that we talk quite a bit about. The ways in which we're trying to get what's in kids' heads out so we can then use it to help them be better thinkers and learners, and to build some of those knowledge pieces. That to me is one of those skill sets. I've never thought about it being as particularly culturally responsive, but to me it really is. How do we develop the skill set in teachers to be and not just intentionally inquiry minded, like designing activities and things, Socratic seminar, but intuitively, where they have that ability to just sort of push kids and make them think in ways that do, I think, get towards what you're talking about.
I think we are in, we're definitely in the same kind of ballpark, right? Because I do think you're right. The inquiry is kind of just part of human learning. I don't know who these people are when you talk about the science. I don't know who those people are. I know everybody's got a brain. We know some stuff about how the brain works. People advocate for different aspects of it. I really advocate for us understanding some of the pieces of that, body of work that apply to how we help students become better learners. But I do agree with you that inquiry is integral to that. I think the point that you made is one that everyone should hear, particularly if they are thinking in terms of equity, reducing the predictability of who is able to succeed because they've got the skill and capacity, who in school is not getting their cognitive capacity developed, right? That's the piece you have to interrupt. And inquiry has to be part of what a learner does to discover their own learning algorithm. They have to be able to actually see where the choke points and the pitfalls are. Like, oh, I keep doing that thing, but it keeps leading me over here. And this is the thing I advocate for when I talk about what's happening in the community of learners. You're not just working on a project together. You're actually stepping back and you're actually talking about your learning. How did you shift your learning? Right, I actually kept making that mistake, but then I changed this and changed that. Most students, particularly if they are underperforming students, don't get a chance to step back and have that own critical analysis of their learning moves, right? We don't develop that capacity. So being a more powerful learner is part of, again, I go back to the definition from the person who actually coined the term, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, developing academic prowess. So even though you say that's not usually how I think about culturally responsive teaching, I think that's part of the thing that teachers need to examine. educators that listen to you need to examine. How do you think about culturally responsive teaching? Because if you don't think about it as instructional decision making and that responsive part, what will I do when the student is stuck? That's DeFore's third question. First question, DeFore talks about should be central to those of us in a professional learning community. What do we want students to know and be able to do? Number two, how will we know when they've accomplished that? Number three, what will we do when they don't learn it? And number four, what will we do when they're ready for more? Question three, what will we do? The student is stuck in front of you. The student is kind of fallen into a cognitive pit. Most teachers don't develop their capacity to understand what will I do and say to the student, not to rescue them, but to help them actually pull themselves up out of that learning pit, as James Nottingham talks about, right? And the learning pit is where the grappling is happening. Mm-hmm. So I do think that inquiry still, to come full circle, inquiry is an important part of that. Both my kids were Montessori kids. They started when they were 3. They went into middle of elementary before we moved out of state where they didn't have, Montessori. They went to high school. We were in a state where they had gone through high school with the Montessori method. And while there is that nice blend, like that's the ultimate project-based learning, right? What Montessori does, because there's practical life, but you're teaching students to actually figure out their own learning moves. What adjustments do I make? Oh, I keep getting this wrong turn. The inquiry has to be not just, I'm going to ask questions about leaves, but I also need to be asking questions about my learning moves. And that's a piece I don't think we know how to coach students on. We assume they come to us already as independent learners. We don't necessarily know how to make them, move them from dependent learning, let go of those dependent behaviors, and fully embrace the capacity, right? Knowing there's going to be a little bit of a dip, but that capacity to be a more cognitively independent student.
So if you want to look at my Twitter feed, you'll see who I'm talking about, these the science of learning folks. Some of them like Paul Kirshner, who's a researcher.
You know what? I probably won't, because I'm about trying to help teachers accelerate, not helping with theorists about what should be included. Children are depending on us. That, to me, is a distraction. I go into school districts where somebody tells me 18% of the students are on grade level at middle school. Oh no, we got some bigger fish to fry than to actually talk and argue about what is or isn't the science of learning. We know how brains work.
Well, I just mentioned that because what I value their work. I think they really make some important points, but some of the things that they will say is that really we want to value efficiency, right? We want to make sure that we're using all of our class time as efficient as possible, which again is why direct or explicit instruction is really tantamount and really important. And some of the things that you're mentioning, of which I think are extremely important, and you're articulating them in a way that's more elegant than I do often, or at least it feels that way. But they will say, we don't. First of all, there's no evidence for that works. That change, learning is a change in long-term memory. That you're doing things that are not supported by a science of learning. I mean, there's a number of things that I can hear. If they're listening to this, they would really be sort of aggravated by almost. And I push back, but it also is, because inquiry is sort of a slippery thing. It is hard to say, well, here's the quantifiable evidence of how this works. But to me, it's a sort of a process that builds upon, it's iterative. And if you start that with young children, it builds upon, and sometimes it doesn't show up right away. It's something that then grows, and all of a sudden the lights turn on. It's like, oh wow, right? I think
that's true, and this is where I think we put the equity piece on, right? Regardless of what those theorists say, I don't engage in that. I engage in what is moving the needle and what's the research base on it. In terms of being able to, from the ground up, within that instructional core, see the influence of that. But I do think that part of what we have to be able to do is actually look at who gets the opportunity to engage and build those muscles around inquiry. And this is the point that I will continue to go back to. Too many classrooms where the larger number of underperforming students are going to be Black, Brown, Indigenous students, linguistically diverse students, multilingual students. They're not getting what you're talking about. Teachers don't trust enough that the struggle, even out of a goodness of their heart, and I talk about this in culturally responsive teaching as the sentimentalist, right? So there's the warm demander. You're not demanding, you're actually coaching students Mr. Miyagi style to that next level, right? Mr. Miyagi wasn't a demander. He wasn't pushing Daniel, but he was actually helping him level up. I'm going to give you a little instruction. I'm going to let you go figure it out, right? How to perfect this. And over time, it's all going to come together with that coaching and that reflection and that feedback loop. That's part of what inquiry is. And I think you're right. What we do strongly agree on is inquiry is essential to learning. And it involves all of those. A little direct instruction. There's a scene in The Karate Kid, right? That original one where Mr. Miyagi comes over to Daniel and says, no, wax on like this, you know? And then he backs up again. It gives there's a little feedback, right? Twist your wrist like this when you're painting that fence, right? And then there are opportunities for them to think about things together and for Daniel to go back and actually expand and then be aware, not just metacognitive, but changing how he approached his own development as a martial artist. You know, and I love movies, so I always use those references when I'm, you know, with teachers, and it's one of my classics that I go back to because that's exactly what he's doing. It's the right mix of challenge. It's the right mix of inquiry. It's inquiry not just into the subject, but into my own process, right? And so that I can change and I can grow, and being a part of that community of learners. You know, those that listen to you, I think what I would really hope they take away from our conversation is, you know, the idea that they should widen their aperture, expand their understanding of the definition of culturally responsive teaching. Because again, if we think it's a thing or treatment, how does it stand in relationship to project-based learning or direct instruction? You know, culturally responsive teaching, the responsive part is the thing we need to think about. The culture part is the schema. Everybody comes with schema. The relational part is so the student shows you who they are. They share that schema with them. There's no way you can get that if the student isn't willing to tell you, if you're not talking to the student. There's no questionnaire you can give to the student you're going to get insight. That comes over time. Oh, I see how you're thinking. Oh, is that what you were watching? Oh, okay. So you start to understand. You know, one of the things I'll always cherish about my son's first Montessori teacher was she was a master teacher, and other teachers would come and learn under her. And she taught me the kid watching. I'm like, you got all these kids, and we sit down, you have all this detail. She just showed me, here's how you do it. You get a card, you pick focal students, you pay attention to students, you have conversations with those students, and you just write these notes. And over time, you have this wealth of information of how they make connections, where they get frustrated. So now you can coach them, but you can't coach them if you don't know them. And culturally responsive teaching is knowing them, but the important part is so that you can use that information to help them build schema, to connect the new to the known.
Yeah. So I tend to frame it as a difference in desirable academic outcomes. And some of the folks that I'm mentioning and referring to, I say they're right about a lot, but they are very rigid and narrow in what they're looking for as desirable academic outcomes, and that there's much more to this process. And you know, I think we're again on the same page. One last question, I think. when we talk about, or one of the ways I talk about inquiry and knowledge and the relationship, but we call it knowledge-rich inquiry teaching. I think about what are the sort of general outcomes I want from learners, again, whatever level they might be. First is engagement, and not just behavioral engagement, but academic or intellectual, cognitive engagement. The other two, and I'm curious how you think about the interplay or the relationship between these two. I think we want engagement. The second piece is thinking, and the third piece is learning. So I want them to think about, and in ways I want them to think. And there's I think an important difference between those things, thinking about what that content, and then in ways, and doing the things with that content I want them to do, critical thinking or just recall or whatever that might be. And then the learning, I want them to learn the things I want them to learn, and those are the typical content academic outcomes. And sometimes people say, well, thinking and learning, that seems redundant, and I don't necessarily disagree, but I'm curious how you think about the relationship between those two things.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I want, and this some of what I was just talking about. I would want students to do both of those, right? Thinking is building the brain's cognitive structures, right? This is literally how our gray matter starts to fold in on itself. The more you're doing this thinking, right, starts with intellectual curiosity. So I don't necessarily lead with engagement. I lead with intellectual curiosity. Intellectual curiosity is going to lead to engagement because your brain is seeking that dopamine hit. It's seeking to learn, to pull things apart and put them back together. And so again, inquiry is I think integral to that process, right, where we're seeking out things to figure out. Right. And learning is a change state. I need to understand something better. I need to recall something more effectively. I need to, right, what's the change state? So my ability to mix the new and the known. So I have new knowledge. I grow knowledge that is usable, to me, is what learning is about. Thinking, and that apparatus what we just talked about, metacognition, metastrategic, the manipulation of that so that we are taking it through that information processing cycle, particularly with elaboration, because we know if the working memory doesn't mix the new with the existing schema, you will not get learning. And there will be nothing to move to long-term memory storage, right? That's the consolidation part. And our brain loves to prune. If you ain't going to use it, it's going to snip it, right? This is pruning. So part of what you're trying to do is turn off pruning because there's intellectual curiosity. You've mixed it. It's usable. And now I've learned it for future use. So that to me is a symbiotic relationship, right? All thinking doesn't lead to learning, but all learning requires thinking.
Yeah, well, that is probably a good place to end. Zaretta, I really appreciate the conversation. Are there things that you want to say that you didn't say? And of course, links and places. You've got a new book coming out, but that's not ready yet. So now's your chance to get all of that stuff out.
We could have so many threads of the conversation, but I think what we did have. And yeah, folks who would like to follow me can do that on X, formerly known as Twitter, and at Ready for Rigor. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn too, for those who would like to know more about kind of, thinking and having these sorts of conversations. I think that's a good place to do. And I do a lot with instructional coaches who are in a really unique position to build their skill and capacity to bring these bodies together. And they can find me as well doing master classes, and they can go to my website. It's going to be revamped soon, but it's still there, crtandthebrain.com, and click on learning, and they can learn about the master classes that I offer that are coming up. And yeah, the book will drop in probably April, probably at the beginning of the year. Pre-orders will start, and I'm super excited about it coming out.
Well, yeah, again, we'll put those in the show notes. You're on X and you said LinkedIn, the website, CRT and the word and the word brain.com. And we'll put that in the show notes as well. So as I said, I appreciate the conversation. And as always, I hope folks find it helpful.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.